All right, and welcome to our mini lesson on the conscription crisis in the First World War. So this one is pretty straightforward and shouldn't take me long. The conscription crisis is basically what it sounds like. It's a crisis around the issue of conscription. So the first thing you need to know is, what is conscription? Conscription, for those of you who don't know, is forced or compelled military service. So to give some perspective, in 1914, when war is declared, the Canadian Expeditionary Force is made 100% of regular soldiers and volunteers. Regular soldiers are people who've signed up for the Army just to be a member of the Army. Like Canada's standing Army is regulars, and then we have some volunteer reservists as well. We don't have a conscript army here. Israel, on the other hand, has a mandatory 2-year conscription service that you have to serve in the Israeli army when you live in Israel. I believe Russia has a mandatory term. China has a mandatory conscription term. At the outbreak of the war, it wasn't uncommon to have that as part of your national philosophy. France, for example, had, until Germany became Germany, France had the largest standing army in Europe. And conventional wisdom was that the French were the power to beat on land, and England was the power to beat at sea. If you could beat one of those two at their own game, you were in pretty good place to be. No surprise then that England and France often were at loggerheads. The German states had been at war with each other and with France and England, and they've been at war in Europe for hundreds of years. Not that you guys know much about the Holy Roman Empire, but it was sort of a loose collection of German states that called themselves an empire and were largely autonomous, though they did have an emperor who was over them all. Anyway, so the emperors aside, conscription was common. Germany had a conscription service thing in their army. France did. I think Belgium did. Most armies in Europe had, and some still do. Austria, for example, still has a mandatory 2-year term. Arnold Schwarzenegger served. He's Austrian, and he served 2 years in the army in Austria as just part of his normal citizenship thing. It's required. Another example would be the draft during the Vietnam War in the United States. We got an awful lot of people up here who were termed draft dodgers. They were people who were being conscripted or forced to serve in the military, and they were running up here to get away from the draft, so they didn't have to go serve in Vietnam. This issue largely came up because Borden went over to France and saw, the effects of the war and what was happening, and far from convincing him that he needed to try and get Canadian soldiers home, instead he thought, we need to send some more Canadian soldiers over there in order to make this make it easier for them to win this war and all come home together. So Borden tries redoubling his recruitment efforts, but the well is drying up. There are only so many military-aged men who can be spared or who are willing to volunteer. Most of them had already volunteered in 1914, 1915, and 1916. So you really, you wind up with this this situation where you're running out of people? The only answer is conscription. You have to start compelling people to serve. This was something that he had kind of promised he wouldn't do at the beginning of the war, but he does it anyway. Now, in order to make sure that this is going to go through, he brings it up as a referendum topic. So a referendum is it's a binding vote by the general population on an issue. But he stacks the election in his favor. So Sir Wilfrid Laurier, former Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, was the leader of the opposition at this time, and he tried very hard to push against this, partly because he was Quebecois. And this is where the divide in Canada comes. So Canadians aren't split down party lines on conscription. They're split down, for lack of a better word, ethnic lines. White English Canada is overwhelmingly in favor of conscription. French Canada is overwhelmingly against it. Now, I mean, the rest of Canada is overwhelmingly larger than Quebec. So, you have an awful lot more people to vote in favor of it. Except, under the laws at the time, women weren't voting. Aboriginals weren't voting. People under 21 weren't voting. The number of people who were allowed to vote was actually quite restrictive. Most of those voting age and voting capable men were already serving in the front line. So, in Quebec, you had a much lower proportion of volunteers, and therefore more people willing to vote, are able to vote against this. Borden deals with this in two ways. He introduces the Wartime Elections Act, which essentially gives suffrage, or the right to vote, to women who are relatives of soldiers. It also gives the right to vote to those soldiers. So their vote would nominally be cast for the candidate in their home riding if it was specified in their paperwork, but there was an awful lot of votes being moved around because the government was allowed to reassign those votes if they didn't have complete paperwork, or the person was in the middle of a move, or what have you. There was a lot of gray area, and the government used it to their advantage and really rigged it for themselves. The outcome of the 1917 election was a landslide in favor of the government and in favor of conscription. Quebec was furious. And this caused a major political crisis in Canada that didn't ever really go away. We're still dealing with some of the fallout of this today. You look at Quebec license plates. The motto on them is "Je me souviens." I remember. Nobody can tell you what exactly they remember, but I can tell you that some of the things they do remember as a group. Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where France basically, the third one, I guess, where France lost Quebec City for the second time, whichever, and basically gave up Canada and left these French Canadians to fend for themselves in this now British-owned territory. And France just said, enough of this North America thing. We're done fighting Britain over this land. It's, furs, and that's great, but anyway. So the French remember that. They remember the conscription crisis in the First World War. And they're going to remember it especially when it comes up again in the Second World War. But we'll get there. So, just to quickly recap, conscription is forced military service. Borden pushes it through with a rigged election. There's I said that he did it with 2 ways. I didn't mention the other act that he used. He uses another act in conjunction with the Wartime Elections Act. I think there's a Military Voters Act or something like that, is the one that lets him reassign votes. And he disenfranchises certain people who would otherwise be able to vote but can't, and makes women who are relatives of active soldiers and therefore are more willing to vote in favor of the government and conscription. He gives them the right to vote. And that is the conscription crisis in a nutshell.